All right. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for our Engaged Journalism Exchange conversation. And I'm Andrea Wenzel. I'm with Temple University. I'm here with Jake. You want to say hi?
Hey everyone, I'm Jake Nelson. I'm a assistant professor at Arizona State University.
And our goal with these conversations is to connect journalists and researchers who are interested in engaged journalism and more to share experiences and swap ideas. And so we're doing these Zoom chats monthly leading up to our 2021 AEJMC virtual pre-conference, which is going to be August 3rd. So today we're going to focus on what it might mean for newsrooms to totally reimagine how they approach crime coverage. Recent police killings of Black people have underlined the need for journalists to think critically about how they relate to police as sources. And these questions connect with broader questions around how communities, especially Black and Brown communities, are represented by news media. Some newsrooms have started to work on reforming their crime coverage, implementing policies to stop using mugshots or rethinking how to engage with police sources. The question we want to get at today is, what would it look like to completely reimagine a crime and safety beat? And to do that, in a little bit, we're going to have a chance for you to share your own experiences in smaller group discussions. But first, we're going to hear perspectives from two people who are trying to transform what crime coverage looks like in local journalism. And just a reminder, so we're going to be taking questions. So please feel free to share in the chat, questions, comments, anything. And we'll have time for Q&A after our speakers share. Both of the speakers today work with the Shift the Narrative Coalition in Philadelphia. The project brings organizers, media makers, and scholars together to address how narratives, storytelling, and journalism around police and criminal legal system directly impact how public discusses issues like defunding the police, public safety, and abolition. In a moment, we're going to hear from Malav Kanuga of the Media Inequality and Change Center at Penn Annenberg. But first, we're going to hear from Tauhid Chappell, who works as a project manager for the Free Press News Voices. He's also an executive board member for Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Tauhid. Thank you. Muted.
Thanks, Andrea. Actually, I'm going to hand it over to Malav to start us off. And we also have like a small slideshow presentation. Is there a way that we can get screen share so we can show a little bit of that?
Who's going to, I'll give both of you.
I'll be the one going to the slides.
Great.
Thanks.
There you have it now, I think.
Okay, well, thank you, Andrea and Jake, for this invitation and this opportunity to share a little bit about what we have been working on, Tauhid and I, and a number of others as part of the Shift Narrative Coalition. What's exciting to me, at least, about this opportunity is to not only sort of share a bit of the thinking and the framework that we're putting into building this coalition around shifting media narratives, but also to be able to lift up some of the work of our member organizations who are doing really important grassroots and campaign based work to create new forms of community responsive and community-based media, as well as to be able to work together to shift the inner workings and the structures of establishment media systems. So the Shift the Narrative project and the coalition is currently comprised of 5 organizations: the Movement Alliance Project, Free Press, Media Inequality and Change Center, Reclaim Philadelphia, Amistad Law Project, YASP, Youth Arts and Self-Empowerment Project, and the Black and Brown Coalition. Is that 5 or 6 organizations? Okay. So the Shift Narrative Coalition in itself is working to reimagine crime coverage. Andrea, as you mentioned, the project comes together over the last couple years, in which the Free Press and Movement Alliance Project and Mike Center, along with a number of other community allies, came together over a series of community workshops and dialogues to discuss what media coverage looks like in Philadelphia, what interests and stories do they represent and serve. An overwhelming theme emerged from those initial conversations, both from local community members who had a number of issues with crime and police coverage, as well as community activists and organizers who were beginning to draw the parallels between how community stories are represented, stories of public safety and urban violence, and how they continue to fuel distrust, misform, and support police narratives around criminal justice as well. Last summer's uprisings in Philadelphia and Minneapolis and across the country only added fuel to the fire and the urgency around these conversations. And so the Shift the Narrative Coalition comes together on this terrain to think about what it looks like to both shift the dominant narratives that are reported around public safety and urban violence and criminal justice in general as a sort of national media discourse, by both shifting and creating and producing and amplifying community stories and working with our membership organizations to create and disseminate new forms of media that are based in communities. So that's via podcasts and op-eds and virtual convenings or in community town halls, media trainings, and a number of other ways of engaging with and understanding community needs around media. The thing that animates our work is also the importance of understanding the sort of the contemporary moment, the historical conjuncture that we're in, to understand how we've arrived here, both at a kind of at the level of a national reckoning or around discourses around policing and criminal justice, as well as how we've arrived here in terms of our structures of media and what are the kind of political economies that are undergirding both those media structures and these larger narratives. So to think about how we arrived here from the kind of origins and the history of the racialization of crime and the criminalization of race, how the rise of policing and mass incarceration has become public policy number one, and have come to stand in and represent solutions to a myriad of problems, and to think about those types of questions and what kinds of narratives are used or mobilized for those purposes that ultimately shape a larger understanding, however contested, around who matters and what matters, and to try to understand those things in the backdrop of what safety and well-being look like, certainly and especially as the last year's rebellion and uprising has brought to the fore, but then of course, all of our myriad experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic as well. So I'll mention also that our theory of change in the organization in this coalition is sort of baked in with that kind of historical understanding of things, but then also both the kind of an attention to how we can directly address coverage by challenging sort of establishment forms of local media practices, but that it simultaneously rests on the work of building narrative power within communities as well. So the aim here is to transform whose stories are being told in media, how those stories are represented, working with journalists and building a shared understanding, shared vernacular and lexicon around those things, but also to figure out how we can shift those narratives by also centering who's doing the storytelling as well. And so part of that is also about shifting sources of journalistic accounts as well, away from so-called authorities or authoritative accounts into more and more diverse community-held and community-led solutions. I'll say one brief thing before I can pass things over to Tauhid to share a little bit more in depth about how the coalition is working and what we're working on more specifically. And that's to highlight a bit of the abolitionist approach to our work. So the conversation around abolition, especially as it's been galvanized in local and mainstream media in the last year, is for us a very important framework for thinking about the types of structural and everyday changes that we want to see in media production and media creation. And so that sort of dual conception of abolition is both about dismantling harmful institutions, specifically those that are based on the sort of larger understanding of what criminal justice requires, which is capture and caging and punishment, exclusion, social death, and abandonment. And to think about the links between those institutions in our society that uphold that type of carceral logic and the relationships between those and our media systems, of course. But the other side of abolition that we take quite seriously in our work is to think about the kind of creative aspects of it, which is to say, what are the more creative and life-affirming institutions that we want to see and to build as well. That creative aspect of it is not just a sort of horizon that we're kind of walking toward, but also a way of recognizing that there is an enormous amount of abolitionist orientation and imagination already in the community, which is to say, when we think about alternatives to mass incarceration and alternatives to policing, that there are that those alternatives exist in the very conceptions and the histories that we share and hold with each other, the ways that we do account for each other and take care of each other. And that type of abolitionist imagination is deeply rooted in our communities in Philadelphia and many other places in the United States. And that part of the work is to be able to acknowledge and shift narrative by using those experiences and that form of community knowledge. It's also to recognize that the media system is profoundly intertwined deeply in the history of this country with white supremacist histories and narratives, which in themselves have been very important for a number of settler colonialist and nativist, which is to say anti-immigrant sentiments and policies that have been also deeply anti-Black and in many ways anti-worker as well, and anti-internationalist in the sense of the media's role in propagating ongoing forms of US imperialism. It's also to recognize that within that very media system, there is an enormously rich counter history of Black and Indigenous and POC journalists, editors, and publishers who have been working to challenge the dominant white supremacist narratives within media from within newsrooms, creating their own newspapers as well. And that there's been an enormous amount of community-generated media within BIPOC communities as well, that every major social struggle or social movement has created its own forms of media as well. And we are the inheritors now of those things as well. So I'll say maybe one last thing, which is to say that to think about media democracy and media justice is to also think about the interconnections between our media systems and other institutions in society, and to take seriously the calls for abolition that are resonant across society, and think deeply from within the media world what that looks like and how we can shift the logics of incarceration and punishment, which is to say and to think again about how media democracy is inherently an impossible demand if we can't think through it through an abolitionist lens. So maybe I'll leave it there and pass it over to Tauhid to share a little bit more in depth about what we're working on the ground.
Thanks, Malav. That was a great setup. And to kind of continue the conversation around techniques and the things that we're doing in terms of action, the Shift the Narrative Coalition came together and really formalized last summer, using all the historical context of what community leaders and community activists were saying about the way that media was covering crime and how that was directly impacting how public discourse was around public safety and mass incarceration and police and crime and gun violence. And so our campaign, so to speak, is two-pronged in a way. Malav mentioned about, powering up community voices, community narratives to intervene, to combat, to counter the usual rhetoric that we so often see in commercial media spaces as they center police and authoritative sources, amplifying their work. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the projects that our coalition members have been doing, amplifying their work and sharing it directly to community members who are in need of direct information around these issues. And then building capacity to bring in more organizations that care about media transformation, that care about community narratives, that care about community-based solutions that are often overlooked underserved or erased within our local media ecosystem. And so that's kind of like the external work that we're doing in the public space, right? In the corporate media space, in the local media ecosystem in Philadelphia, we are trying to create new standards and ethics on how journalists meet the demands of community members. We are currently trying to work with newsrooms like the Philadelphia Inquirer and exploring options with other newsrooms as well to talk about the fact that, the reporters, the ones that do cover courts and crime and police and institutions of the carceral state, that they're not meeting the needs of community members that are directly impacted by these institutions. And it's not even so much the people that are currently occupied in these positions of power, privilege, and platform, but more so pulling from that history that these institutions have historically never answered the demands and the needs of these communities that have been directly impacted by mass incarceration, police, the criminal legal system, and the media that perpetuates these harms as well. And again, all this history is not lost on Black and Brown communities that continue to feel othered by this lack of coverage, that continue to feel othered when they see police having center stage in stories around how crime is being handled, how solutions should be held, and the types of monetary investments that should be going into programs that may or may not actually support Black lives to address these issues. And so we are trying to create and collaborate with newsrooms and with journalists to say, this work is important. We recognize the direct influence that media has on policies, on direct policies, on public perception, and on how people imagine public safety. And so by working with communities and members that have lived experiences, direct lived experiences, we are hoping that we are creating a more healthy and a more accessible and equitable media ecosystem that actually serves the needs of people that have been hurt by police and crime and gun violence, and not so much just serve a product for consumers to try to consume, but actually meet a service around these information needs. And again, pulling from the community listening sessions from the work that Free Press, Matt, and Mike have been doing, it's evident that these needs have not been met, and they need to be met now more than ever. So the role of community media making, Malav did a really good job of talking about, abolition, how it works in terms of media creation and transformation. Again, part of our community work on the external front of our campaign is building that capacity within organizations that care about narrative control, that care about narrative intervention, that care about talking about these, what may seem as abstract ideas, but talking about these ideas in a more public manner that actually gets people to think about how we can actually approach public safety in a way that has not been approached in the current way right now. And I just want to mention, part of abolition media is transforming media from a tool that fortifies oppression and state control to a tool that empowers communities to confront oppression. When communities don't see solutions, when communities don't see their voices, when communities don't see the direct solutions that could confront these oppressive institutions, that lack of information leads them at a disadvantage to talk about the impact that police violence has on their communities, at a disadvantage of talking about the community solutions that may well exist in their neighborhoods, but they may not even know exist, right? And so being able to transform media through an abolition lens allows communities to feel like they have the power, they have the knowledge, and they have the tools to not only identify, but to also actively say how they can change and actually address these issues that affect their lives and their neighborhoods. And so what are we up against in a way? In a way we've mapped out, and Malav also mentioned this, is that there's a lack of imagination. What does a world without police look like? A lot of people can't even fathom that. What does a world without prisons look like? A lot of people can't think about that. There's also a lack of abstract ideas, there's abstract ideas that are often distorted or centered or platformed by police or those that are in authoritative institutions that distort community narratives on what solutions that they think are most beneficial to their needs. We're also talking about the fact that community voices have historically always been silenced or marginalized or sometimes buried within news articles, whether it's TV, radio, or print, and often they're not at the forefront or centered around how they should be addressing these issues, and not the people that are currently in power who have not been addressing these issues for decades. And then also there's a lack of structural and systemic context, right? A lot of these stories around police and crime are often siloed. They're never connected. There's no nuance. There's no context. There's no connection between gun violence and poverty, mass incarceration and housing, homelessness and evictions, right? And so without that lack of connection, you often do not get to see the whole wider picture of how multiple variables are coming into place, especially around divestment, how those play a role in the ongoing violence that we continuously see in Black and Brown communities. And so when you have all these four kind of buckets that are not being consistently addressed within our journalism, the fragmentation leads to people not being able to communicate how they should actually transform these oppressive institutions. And it also fractures how we connect with each other around like-minded and lived experiences as well. And so we're really trying to address all these in various ways, shapes, and forms, whether that's building our own media platforms, amplifying our own stories, or trying to get the people that are in these positions of power, specifically journalists and media, to talk about why addressing context, why addressing nuance, why connecting all these structural issues in their reporting consistently is necessary to keep our communities not just safe, but informed and civically and politically engaged as well. And just to underline, how are we combating these barriers? Handing the mic over to community members, not centering ourselves, but really looking at people with lived experiences, direct lived experiences, to talk about their perspective, to talk about their solutions, to talk about the ways that the systems that we think are rehabilitating people are not rehabilitating people, right? Looking at the realities within a broader structural and historical context of racial capitalism, and how prisons profit off of harm, how media profits off of Black harm, right? Looking at those ways and being able to kind of talk about those in a concept where all of these things are interconnected, right? Malav really talked about this earlier, is that all these things are interconnected. When media perpetuates drug use to crime to Black communities, those policies end up coming out to address tough on crime and tough on drugs, which end up hurting Black and Brown communities. So how can we kind of take all these structural issues and connect them to talk about the larger issues of how capitalism is really driving the force of all this harm that we're seeing in our communities? And then also, as we do like to call out harmful narratives within the media ecosystem, it's also bringing people in to talk about how we can improve and work together. Journalists have such an opportunity to change narratives. Journalists have such an opportunity to really highlight solutions that are often overlooked. And how can they improve that if they're not listening to our community members that really see these things on a day-to-day basis? How can we invite them into our conversations to have them build a better consciousness so that they can be a little bit better in their reporting? And again, go back to providing a service, not just a product for a person to consume, but an actual service that actually helps a person's livelihood and shows that news is actually important to their day-to-day well-being. And so we have, Malav and I have mentioned a little bit about some of the podcasts, or not podcasts, some of the work that our coalition members have been doing. Move It Forward podcast by Amistad Law. We have one of the producers, Ghani, a person with lived experience. He was incarcerated, talking about what does public safety look like from an abolitionist perspective? What does public safety look like if defund police were actually to work? What would public safety look like if other services like mental health services or housing were actually funded and addressed and not the police? What does that look like? And how do we move those conversations from imagination to reality? And so the Move It Forward podcast is a really good one that talks about that. We often see, So Movement Alliance Project, MAP, did a Safety Week in Field survey that actually was published in February. And that basically talked about, I think they surveyed about 1,300 Philadelphians to say, what are resources or things that you think would make your community or make yourself feel safe? How do you feel about the current financial support that certain institutions, police, are getting versus these other resources that you've identified are a necessity. And really the Safety Week and Feel survey did come out to say, so many people care more about other institutions that actually support their well-being and safety. And those institutions are not police. Those institutions are not prisons. Those institutions are not jails. That these other resources are not being allocated enough because all this money is directly going into these institutions that continue to uphold white supremacy and also continue to uphold harm. And so the survey was a good opportunity for people to see a little bit more public discourse that people really rather see more investment in other services and not investment in services that continuously do not actually keep us safer. And then the Heart series from Reclaim talks about survivor stories, people who have been assaulted in various ways, and how you can open up about that and talk about your mental health as it pertains to being a survivor. And what does that mean, especially if you are a victim or a survivor of police violence. And so, tailoring these types of content, we're not seeing this content directly, explicitly, consistently in our local media institutions right now. So we are building this ourselves, and we're building it for our people that we know are actually directly impacted. And we're talking about it in a way that opens up these conversations and invites people, rather than having people be kind of a neutral reader and reading a newspaper and not really comprehending the deeper context behind these topics. And then the last thing, I got to plug myself too. Free Press is working with our coalition to transform how the criminal legal system is being reported on, how crime is being reported on, how police are being accountable. And like I'd mentioned earlier in the earlier slide, we are working directly with newsrooms like the Inquirer, working with their reporters to talk about what information needs are not being met by communities that are experiencing police violence and violence from mass incarceration, and how can you actually directly meet those needs to not only keep people safe, but also show that journalism is important, that journalists do matter, that this work does have direct consequences on people's lives. And so that there's an opportunity to work and align ourselves more with the people who have been hurt and actually hold these institutions more accountable than we have been in the past. And so, we're not seeing some of these things happen directly in our media ecosystem as we know it in Philadelphia. We historically have never really seen it in the way that we've needed it to see. And so the Shift the Narrative Coalition, again, is trying to create those platforms, create those spaces, create those information trees, because when we find it that's lacking in one space, we have to create it for our own. And sometimes that's the best way to do it, because that shows when we talk about abolition, this is what we mean. When we talk about defund, this is what we mean. It helps add that clarity. It adds that context, that nuance that often goes missing within the day-to-day reporting around crime, police, and the criminal legal system. And so that's a little bit about us. That's a little bit about the work that Malav and I are doing. And I'm very lucky and very glad to be a part of it. And I'm very, very humbled to be in positions, in digital rooms like this one, to be able to talk a little bit more about it. So thank you.
Thank you both. That was great. And I'm excited for us to have a conversation about it. And I also just want to recognize that we have some folks on this call who are either in newsrooms grappling with this themselves or who have been doing research on this work or on this broader issue. So I'm excited to hear from all of you. So I'm going to actually hand it over to Jake to lead our Q&A discussion. Jake, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, so just to echo what Andrea said, thank you both Tauhid and Malav so much for being here and for that really awesome presentation. So we're not seeing a lot of questions in the chat yet, but I'm gonna get started with a few that I have. And while I'm asking them, for those of you that are attending, please feel free to either raise your hands or just put questions in the chat so that we can turn this into a discussion that's not just me asking questions. But just to get started, I was really interested in Tauhid and Malav, both of you talking about the relationship between local news ownership and the funding models for local news and the problems that you're identifying with crime coverage. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that relationship, like just how significant an influence is the source of revenue and the source of ownership of local media when it comes to the problems that you've identified within crime coverage that you're hoping to work towards solving. it's really for either of you. So whichever
Malav,
one.
do you want to go first, or I can?
Well, I don't have numbers to back this. I mean, mapping the ownership of this is a really important part of the project, a larger project of understanding the sort of structural inequalities of our media system, and the kind of dollars and cents of how media ownership structures, editorial policies, and things like that. So I don't have a kind of like clearer framework to address that question. Tauhid, perhaps you do as well, but I want to quickly plug one thing, which is I think an important way to think through this historically, that folks at the Free Press have undertaken in this past year, a document that they very, very imaginatively researched and produced and published in the fall of 2020, called Media 2070, which is both looking back historically, as I was alluding to earlier in my comments about how to think how we've arrived at the media structures that we do have in place in society today, and then to also imagine what that looks like over the next 50 years or so. And the patterns of ownership there are quite remarkable in the sense of the ways in which a number of different logics. It's not just the sort of economics of capitalism, but what we draw on in thinking about the ways in which economics and race operate together to form, historically what we understand to be racial capitalism. The role of those things in media are enormously important, and the ownership parts of those things are certainly a prime sort of target of research as well. So Tauhid, do you have a sense of more specifically about how that?
Yeah, I don't have specific numbers like the dollar signs, but we know in the paper that Malav had mentioned, the Media 2070 paper, which is media reparations for Black communities, it does a good job in kind of showing a timeline of just white ownership beginning creating the media industry as we know it. All the perks that white publishers and later, white TV station owners and radio owners were able to get with licenses, and how that kind of created an early monopoly over information that was, again, focused on white-centered issues. And then there's also, I dropped another article that my colleague Alicia Bell talked about, was that newspapers made money off of slave ads, right? Like there was a direct capital investment and capital necessity to run slave ads for profit, right? In newspapers. And I think the last link that I sent talks about how Knight Foundation's history is derived from making money off of that, right? Like part of that money is coming from actual running slave ads. And so, if we're looking at the fact that from the dawn of this colonized land that we sit on, that we call the United States, that it has always been owned by white people, white men in particular, that that the money has always been the money has not been for the safety of Black and brown lives, that the money has always been to help police, and that the ongoing evolution of the media from print to what we call sensational journalism and the rise of tabloid media and entertainment media has always been fixated on the theater of violence, the theater of drama, the theater of the other, right? And newspapers made that money, right? Newspapers made money running sensational headlines around Black people using cocaine and going wild, even though that was false, right? They made money off of, following police and watching them arrest or murder Black people and reporting on that. And so there's a historical connection which shows that newspapers and later TV and broadcast have always made profit whenever it came to stories around crime, violence, and most of those stories, the majority of those stories have always been at the center point where Black people are involved or people of color are the victims or survivors of this violence. And that continues to this day. We still have tabloids, right? We still have those types of sensational media products still existing because there's an audience still for that, right? And then more subtly, like we had mentioned and showed in the slideshow, that these headlines like "Buildings Matter Too" continue to perpetuate that harm, right? They continue to cause shock and reaction, and people read that, people click on that. There's still a response in terms of like web traffic now that is showing, hey, people are really into this type of reporting, or people are into this type of headlines, right? And so I think that fundamentally speaking, when you have an industry that has been raised and expanded upon because of Black harm, you know, it's the bedrock of this industry, right? It literally is the bedrock of this industry. And I think that is also really kind of the thing that I've been slowly trying to like advocate more and more as I've started to learn, is that these institutions have to acknowledge that, right? These institutions have to look at their own history and say, we've made money off of this, and we played a role, an active role in this. And how do we reconcile with that? How do we start making amends for that? How do we start repairing the harms that we've been participating in for generations, right? Because we're starting to see, you know, we see the industry use diversity, equity, inclusion, throw it around like a buzzword, but they can't even recognize the harms that they've created generationally from their own product, right? So I hope that answers that question, but that's just to say is that the business model is all messed up. The business model has always been messed up. And if it's going to continue in this way, we're only going to continue to see the shrinking of the industry as we know it.
Thank you for that. I have so many more questions that I could ask about this relationship between ownership and the actual content that we see in the news. But I see that people are raising their hands. So I think I'm going to just go in order of who raised their hands when. Christopher, do you want to go first? And then we'll go to Lisa.
I'll pass to Lisa first.
Lisa, you want to go ahead?
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. So I am a professor at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, and I'm also a freelance journalist, and I report mainly on incarceration. And so I have a question about stuff that's come up more in my teaching. I teach a class in conjunction with the CUNY Law School, where our students profile people who are seeking clemency. The law students represent the folks seeking clemency in New York State prisons. And so last semester, something that came up was one of the students identified himself as a prison abolitionist. And so in his correspondence with the person that he was profiling, a lot of the language that he used was something that would be used more by an advocate than, say, a journalist. And one of the things that we talked about in class, we talked a little bit about movement journalism, and we talked a little bit about advocacy. But one of the issues that I run into is that if I'm not really clear in my work in terms of making sure that I get responses from the Department of Corrections, from all the other sides, then people already assume, because of my work is centered on incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated people, people assume a sense of bias. You know, so I need to make sure that I have that balance. And one of the things that we talked about is that if you write someone who's in prison, who's seeking clemency, and you represent yourself as an advocate as opposed to a journalist, there's a sense of hope that comes with that. So this person thinks you are going to help me. Whereas I know from my own journalism that sometimes people are helped kind of in the interim. So someone might be taken out of solitary confinement, for instance, after an article comes out, but then 4 months later, they might be put back in. So I guess the question is, how do you, if you had my student, for instance, who was arguing, well, we shouldn't have prisons at all, this whole system needs to be rethought. So I'm approaching my work profiling this person as an advocate. What advice would you have for that student? Because I think this is going, I mean, hopefully we're teaching this class again in the fall. It will be the third year that we're doing this. But it's just, you know, as I said, it's something that's come up, and I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on how to handle that.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is, at least I'm hoping that this person's doing that with this person who's seeking clemency, is really being open and transparent and managing expectations. I think there is a lack of media education from the interviewee side on what does a journalist do? What is your role? Who are you? Like what are you supposed to be doing? Why does this help? How does this help me? Yeah, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, you know, as I've been doing a little bit more research just around, you know, harm reduction approach and trauma-informed approach to journalism, especially around these sensitive topics, one of the things that I continue to see is managing expectations on what this story, what this angle is supposed to be. What is it going to do to this person? How could this directly impact their life? You know, there could be legitimate impact of a story coming out on a person and having some sort, like you mentioned, having some sort of change in their situation. But I think at the end of the day is that, you know, one of the things that journalists should always be aware of, and I don't think this is like a thing that is common practice, but really, you know, not overselling a story, not overselling the impact that a story may have, and making sure that there's a clear understanding of what this person's getting involved with if they decide to talk to this person, and what is the expectation of what's going to happen after the story comes out. And also, what is this person going to do after the story comes out? Are they going to still continue the story? Are they still going to continue a relationship? Is there going to be any follow-up? Is the interviewee going to be expecting anything after the fact too? Or how are they going to know that anything has happened if the story comes out, and how are they going to be communicated by that? I think it's, you know, for lack of a better way to say this, I think it's always situational too. Because, you know, I think that there's journalists who are often, you know, not saying, you know, if you tell me your story, this is going to happen. They're not proposing that. But sometimes, you know, a journalist is going to, you know, get good quotes, write a story, and then their actual story does lead to policy change, whether that was intended or unintended. And so for me, I think it's always just managing expectations and making sure exactly the person knows what they're getting themselves into and what that might mean for their situation, whether that's for better or for worse. But that's just me personally. Malav, I don't know if you have any other recommendations.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I think that's such an important question, and so tell that it's deeply informed by your experiences in the classroom and in the newsroom. And I think Tauhid's answer to think about the kind of relationality of what those encounters look like, not as a sort of, you know, one-time transaction. I mean, really thinking deeply about how transactional journalistic practices can be, how that mirrors the sort of the transactions, the sort of like the kind of commodification of stories and lives as a way of kind of producing and you know, news that in itself is a commodity. And to think otherwise, what types of other human-centered relationships are we striving for? That's easier said than done, but those relationships, I think, really are at the heart of a kind of abolitionist orientation to these questions. So hopefully that would stoke your students' imagination there. I also heard a related question that you were posing around kind of ethics, or I suppose that's sort of the challenge of what non-objective or, you know, biased or unbiased news looks like, and when it's interpreted as advancing a certain mission. And there, that's a thornier and more difficult question. Of course, it's related to so many other questions about, you know, to what degree ought we, you know, strive for a kind of the real conditions of freedom in media, journalism, and storytelling. But in that regard, I suppose I would also just maybe ask about to what degree these are not just, again, issues that can be kind of, you know, posed in a marketplace of ideas, but rather all about like deep histories that we do share in one way or another, and emphasizing the sort of context and the nuance of how individuals are thrown into situations that you know, on surface level might our understandings of the kind of everyday operations of the criminal justice system won't really allow us to understand. And that kind of context and nuance is at the same time, I think, deeply related to that question of relationality as well that Tauhid was speaking about.
Thank you. I see Danielle, you have your hand up, and then I'll go to Timothy after you. So yeah, Danielle.
Yeah, thanks so much for putting this on, and my apologies for being like super sweaty. I had to get my Peloton in. I was listening. 2 for 1 there. So thanks so much for putting this on. I like echo so much of what you guys do, and I'm in newsrooms, and so I'm really glad to know that like we're all working together with the same sort of messaging. And I had a question that comes to me often when I'm in newsrooms that I just was going to bounce off you guys, and it's really about like, what do we do with the double standards that already exist, and what are the best ways to approach guiding journalists and editors to address those double standards in an equitable way, not an equal way, but an equitable way. So I'm thinking like the easiest example I could think of when you guys were talking was like with the opioid crisis. So, you know, the double standard is that white people can be victims and Black and brown people tend to be criminalized more often in their coverage. And, you know, if we reimagine sort of the normative of what's right and what it's supposed to look like, how do we encourage not just how people report on communities of color, but also how they report on white people who are in these spaces? You know, aside from what I normally do is like tell them to report more on white people in these spaces and know about the balance that doesn't occur. But also, you know, is that sensational? I mean, this is all mixed up with the economics, right? Is the sensational approach to this cells mean that we encourage them to push that onto, like, how do we negotiate this with the economics of the sensationalism part of things, right? Like, what do we really push them to do, and what should those narratives look like that are equitable? And it makes me feel a little uncomfortable about what is specifically how people should report about white people going forward. Should they reimagine that part of things?
I got thoughts, but I'm trying to. So to clarify, are you saying like moving forward, how should white people report on white issues, like moving forward in an equitable sense?
Right.
When we're talking about equity, so we're not so that we're not erasing, you know, white-centered issues or issues that directly impact white communities, right? If we are expanding the capacity of reporting on issues that impact BIPOC communities, how do we make sure that, you know, white communities are not being left out in this type of coverage, right? Is that just
not even, I mean, not being left out, right? Being part of the narrative, but also when they are included, having, which narrative do they get? You know, like what does equity look like in that space? How do you cover that? Is it the exact same way with the exact same sympathy? Is it, you know, with the exact same community understanding, or is it different? Do you reimagine it different because of the balance differences that have already existed because of the media?
This is a good question. Malav, you might have a better answer than I will on this, but something that I have been thinking about, and I'm glad you brought up the opioid crisis, because, you know, suddenly it became popular when it impacted white people, but yet when we talk about the crack cocaine or even marijuana prohibition, you know, there's very much a complete 180 on how the sympathy and the humanization of Black and brown communities were what's it called? Centered, or lack thereof, in media. I think what it comes down to me personally is I guess the conversations that we've been currently having around kind of that human first, people first, identity first approach is that how, regardless of race, class, structure, background, is how do you look at people as humans, humans that are suffering? And how do you look at it as a way that these institutions and structures are failing everybody, not just failing Black people, not just failing Asian Americans, not just failing white people, but failing everybody, right? And how do we bring that humanity? How do we center the humanity of people regardless of their background, while also acknowledging somehow, some way in the story or in a larger conversation around the privilege that white people do have in getting their needs addressed as well? And how do we kind of report on that privilege without erasing the ongoing pain and harm that people are experiencing? I don't really have a good answer for you on that one, Danielle, to be quite honest, because, you know, for me, it's like, okay, let's if we can talk more about the person, as a human that is suffering from opioid, and the failure of a system that is supposed to help them. How can we talk about it from a failure, or a system's failure, right, or an institutional failure? But also at the same time, how do we be sensitive to the fact that a white person may have a more privileged or accessible opportunity to find treatment or services that a Black person may not either? And how do we kind of keep that in mind as well? Because people may obviously then think, oh, anyone can get this, or anyone can seek help, when that may not be the case because of racism and white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. So, I don't have a good answer for you on that one, Danielle, to be quite honest. I don't know how, especially with the the transforming of newsrooms too, how that will play in. But Malav, if you have like a better response to that, by all means. But for me, I think it's just going down to the how do we center the humanity around this? How do we center the person just as a person who's suffering, and the larger issues around that, rather than always having to center the specific socioeconomic background, if that is actual pertinent to the reporting itself. But that's just me personally. I don't know. I mean, and also before you speak, sorry, Malav, like also it's hard because for generations, white people have been centered, right? Generations, this has always been something that has never been centered around our issues, right? So like how do we reckon with that, right? How do we reckon with that? And I think those conversations within newsrooms has to be about intentionality as well. Like, who are we intentionally sourcing? Who are we intentionally centering? How are we going to center? If we do choose to talk to a white person over a Black person, how are we going to reflect that in our reporting as well? I think those are a lot of issues that editors are now grappling with because they've never had to think about that in the first place. But it also ties into, who's the audience? Who are you trying to reach? Who are you trying to educate or inform with these stories as well? Because if you're trying to diversify your readership, if you're trying to reach different communities that you're not reaching as a newsroom, and you're only continuing to uplift and center white people, then you're kind of going against the whole mission of trying to transform your newsroom or your company in general. That's just my personal opinion. But Malav, go for it.
Well, actually, sorry, Malav, I don't mean to stop you from talking. We only have a few minutes left, and I would love for Timothy to get a chance to ask his question. Malav, do you mind if I let Timothy ask a question, and then maybe you just start with the answer to that one?
Absolutely.
As you can all see, this conversation has been great and gone to the point where we are not doing breakout session groups within this.
We were supposed to do that. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I mean, the conversation was just so worthwhile on its own that Andrew and I were just like, why would we mess that up? So I'm going to shut up. Timothy, would you like to ask your question? And then Malav, please jump in and answer it.
Hi, everyone. I have kind of also, I guess, a more, practical question. And something that is a big topic right now in Philly, obviously, is gun violence and homicides. And I'm wondering how you guys conceive of the idea of newsworthiness of crime. Like, why do we cover quote unquote crime? And like, I think the traditional thing, right, is like, if someone gets shot and killed, like, a news outlet does a story about that. But like, what, like in your mind, like, why do we cover when people get shot, or should we cover when individual people get shot? We're talking about systems failure. Should we cover it only as, like the structural conditions that lead to people getting shot? Should we cover every time someone does get shot? How do you, I guess, what's that in your mind in terms of crime is newsworthy to begin with?
Thank you, Timothy, for that question. I appreciate it. Structural, for me, in my opinion, has been the dominant ask in the spaces that I've occupied, is that there has been less coverage on structural issues and more coverage on the day-to-day shooting without that context. And because there's that lack of context, there's that lack of understanding of how everything is interconnected. That's not to say that, stop reporting on shootings that happen or victims of gun violence and police violence. But I will say that at least the ongoing conversations we've been having with community members in Philly has been the yearn for structural reporting that focuses much more on the structure and the connection of the institutions rather than the day-to-day four graph overnight shooting that has one quote from a police officer and nothing else on the actual person who lost their life, right? We can't honor a life if we are just going to center police and not actually center the person that has lost a life. And we can't obviously start to begin to have people understand these institutions as a whole if we're not talking about how they're all interconnected as well. So I guess, personally gut check, my preference would be report on the structures and always report on the structures and always include the structural information. And regardless of any story around crime, police, or the criminal legal system, that has always been lacking. And that should be a staple of reporting in some way, shape, or form, in my opinion.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just jump in. I don't know if we have a hard stop at 1 o'clock or not.
You're okay.
Okay, well, I'm not sure exactly how to say this in as few words as possible, but I think Timothy, your question is in part in my mind wrapped up into Danielle's question as well, and to think about it in that regard about how we do check our understandings, or like sort of the received understandings of what constitutes violence, right? And so if we can enlarge our scope and understanding historically and with context, what not only what are the kind of direct and immediate consequences or causes of gun violence in an everyday ordinary sense, but rather which is to say, the direct relationship and dependency on a kind of like policing framework, which is not just an over-policing issue, but policing in general, and the ways in which that already sets the conditions for a type of ordinary violence to unfold. But to think about other forms of violence that are a little bit harder to see. But on the flip side of it as well, to think about all the forms of safety that are already existing in the community, and all of those things together report a different kind of way of understanding and interpreting and then intervening in the world. I think all of those things can and should be debated, across the newsroom, should be spaces of accountability and reflection across newsrooms and communities. And then maybe a little bit more specifically, Danielle, to your question, which is a really kind of ambitious one, I think, is to think about some of the calls for media reparations and really kind of challenging the legacies and the ongoing forms of harm that media perpetuate, that the call for reparations in that regard, just like the sort of larger call for abolition, is it's not a sort of negative demand, in the sense that those calls actually benefit everyone. And the way, this isn't maybe a direct answer to your question, Danielle, about equity, but the ways in which we redress and repair actually do benefit everyone. And so that starting point, I think, is an important thing to kind of to bake into an orientation around this. And then also to be mindful of the ways in which all of this harm in itself is structured around what we might call, I learned this from Sylvia Winter's work, like narrative condemnation. And in that regard, the sort of question of equity has to also be kind of put through this an understanding of what types of narratives have been put together for what purposes and what time, and what types of condemnation those result in, and how forms of repair there relate to larger questions of how whiteness is enacted and constructed in media tellings. Sorry, that was a lot to try to squeeze in. I hope that answers a bit of both of those questions. Maybe I'll pass it back to Andrea and Jake and Tauhid to get the last words in.
Thank you so much. This is, foolhardy of us to think we're going to be able to tackle all of this in as much detail as we'd like in a 1 hour period. But we've tried, and we covered a lot of ground. I think we just scratched the surface in so many ways. And what I would love is if we could kind of follow up with you guys, particularly once you've been doing more of this work with newsrooms, because I think there's a lot of nuts and bolts conversations that, I would love to know more about the the new standards and ethics that you're working on, and just sort of what that looks like in practical terms. I think people ask us about that all the time. So I think we're probably going to have to wrap it up. If folks want to stick around for a second, they can, but I think I'm going to probably have to close this down and stop recording here in a second. I do want to let folks know that we'll send around an email with the recording, with the chat. We'll save the chat, and also let you know then when the next session we're going to do is coming up. It'll probably be May 24th, but we'll and also, if you have ideas for things that you would like us to discuss in these conversations, please share them with us. And we'll be doing these monthly leading up to AEJMC. But thank you so much. This is a really great group of folks. And then thanks for your rolling with us through our conversation. And we'll do more breakouts in the future. But this was great to hear from everyone. Anyone want us to share any last words? Okay.
Thank you for having us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you for hosting us. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I've